after the talk, you might have some questions about that as well. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Pearson, and he can share his screen and take it away.
Good. So screen sharing working? Yes. Thumbs up. Great. And so I was joking just before we started the session here that I usually have a formal title for my papers. And when I give a talk, I always share that formal title, but I also have an informal title. And the informal title of this talk has to do with race, and it's white, black, or brown in Detroit, how poverty, place, and stress impact racialized differences in health. And I'll open today by bringing greetings to you from Duke University, which sits upon the historical lands of the forcibly displaced Sara, Saponi, and Shakora people, and was built upon the slave labor of forcibly removed West African Senegambia people and their descendants. I am also compelled to acknowledge that Oregon State University sits upon the historical lands of the Kalapuya people. So today I will be presenting on my research directly associated with race, ethnicity, socioeconomic indicators. For the purposes of today's talk, I'll be concentrating on socioeconomic status, structural racism, and place, and how these four constructs interact to drive differences in lived experience that become physically embodied, manifesting as racialized differences in health outcomes. Before any of that, though, I'll take another 4 minutes to share my personal biography, complete with pictures. My mother, who self-identifies as Black American, tells me that when I was born, that my father, who self-identifies as Black Indian of the Halawa-Saponi people, arrived at the hospital late and got into an argument with an Italian man who had mistakenly identified me as his son. When I was a child, because my family, particularly my father and my great uncle Jesse, his uncle, thought it was important, I got to be both Black and Indian. And this continued throughout my entire childhood until my early teen years, when my family moved off of the farm that we had previously lived at into an all-Black trailer park, where the kids there told me in no uncertain terms that I was not and could not be Indian, and that I would only be Black. Years later, after I finished undergrad and joined the Peace Corps, I served in Honduras. The village that I lived in there had not previously seen a person of color from the United States of America. And so they were really curious about who I was and what my racial and ethnic heritage was. And so when asked, I would respond that I was Black. The people there told me that I was not Black, that I was trigueño, which is a different description of my mixed lineage. And the reason that they told me this is because the skin color gradations that determine social positioning in Honduras are significantly more nuanced than those that we have here in the States. At the time, they had 27 different skin color descriptions, and trigueño, again, was simply a different higher status description of my mixed lineage. They, in a sense, were attempting to look out for me. They wanted me to aspire to my highest possible color status. And to a greater or lesser degree, that experience has been replicated in other countries that I've worked and traveled during time in Latin America, different countries in both Central and South America. More recently, I guess it was 10 years ago now, I did some research on the health implications of Jewish identity in the United States of America. And a number of folks, when I would go to conferences to present this paper, assumed that I was Jewish. So I was, arguably born Italian, got to be both Native American and Black in my childhood, became only Black as a teenager and in my early adult years, went to Latin America, was told that I was not Black, and then later in life got to be Jewish, right? Now, in terms of my formal training, I went from a model of individual behavior change as an undergraduate, health education, to a model of community assessment when I worked on my master's degree at the University of North Carolina. And then when I started my PhD training at the University of Michigan, got introduced to structural and institutional level analysis. And what was really interesting to me about this move from the individual to the community to the structural/institutional is that across the various disciplines, again, health education, health behavior, health demography, and social epidemiology, was that there was a relatively greater, stronger emphasis placed on data and methods as fundamental drivers of research efforts versus deep, probing, conceptually and theoretically driven investigations. I was much more interested in how we framed the research than I was in the available data. And so, quite frankly, largely as a function of my lived experience, I decided to concentrate more on the theoretical and conceptual front, right? Because I think it's important. And the lessons that I learned from this broad range of experiences, both in terms of my informal education and my formal education, is that these identity construction processes, both racial and ethnic formation, are dynamic. And the sets of resources which may promote health and risk which compromise health, right, vary as a function of how others in a particular social setting, that is a particular social context, viewed me, how I in turn responded to that, and how those with whom I most strongly identified also viewed me. And so the majority perception of who I was, how I responded to that, and then how minority groups in turn responded to me. And these experiences have shaped literally the work that I do, why I do it, and even the way that I go about doing it. And so put another way, I cannot come before you here today in good faith claiming detached scientific objectivity because my perspective has been directly and profoundly impacted by these lived experiences, and I acknowledge that. I do, however, lay claim to always aspiring to bring legitimate academic rigor to bear in the form of truth-speaking, honesty, transparency, and good method. Additionally, and for the record, I am also of the opinion that no social scientist, given that we are all human and have socialized human experiences, operates completely independent of influences from their identity socialization processes. Some of us in the academy, though, occupy social identities and privileged positions, related perspectives that are dominant, that have become normalized and normative, and consequently frequently mistakenly viewed as objective. My specific interests are on the social determinants of population health differences. And by social determinants, we mean broad processes which influence the context within which resources and risk, resources that promote health and risks that compromise it, are differentially distributed, and the interpopulation level differences in length and quality of life that are differentially influenced by these differential distributions of resources and risks, that is the underlying lived experience. The definition of health demography that I use, the definition of population health that I use is drawn from health demography, which suggests that we're interested in the health status of all residents in the nation. In this case, we're talking about the United States of America, who are regularly engaging the major institutions which comprise broader society. And we're interested in this distribution of health over the life course, that is from birth to death. Moreover, this definition of population health also suggests that in addition to the conventional predictors of health that most health policy experts consider, which are insurance, medical care provision, individual behavior, and conventionally measured socioeconomic resources, there are an additional broad range of social phenomena that operate across multiple dimensions of society and at multiple levels of influence within it, which influence health. And if we're serious about what we will come to know today as health equity, there are trade-offs associated with which of these two perspectives we place greater relative value on, the conventional predictors or whether or not we take seriously the business of considering the broader social context in which health decision-making is frequently engaged. Right? In terms of health differences research, two major themes. The first is a core tenet associated with health differences research in the US holds that socioeconomic status, one or some combination of education, occupation, or income measured at the individual, household, or community level is considered to be a direct and robust predictor of health, right? And so we see large increases in health status from low to median levels of SCS, with a diminished but still detectable gradient from median to high levels, and then a flattening of the curve from high to extremely high levels of SCS. A second major tenet is the existence of well-documented, profound, and persistent differences in quality of life, social well-being, and health across various outcomes between white Americans and select populations of color, namely Black Americans, Native Americans, and some Latino and Asian populations. Really important heterogeneity within the Latino and Asian groups. And so we bring to bear some caution when we talk about health differences or health disadvantage within those populations, because it varies tremendously contingent upon national origin or ethnic identity within those broad categories, but those differences do exist for some select populations. In terms of racialized health differences, three terms that are used to describe these differences. And it's important for us to make a distinction between these three terms, because which of these we choose has implications for our capacity to integrate the full range of findings across racialized health differences in the US context. The first term is disparities, which simply documents that differences exist and leaves open to interpretation why they exist. And explanations such as underlying genetic differences, group level differences in individual behavior choice, or even cultural attributions have been used to describe these simple differences in health. The second term is racialized health inequality, which assumes that because populations of color, again, particularly Black Americans and Native Americans, are disproportionately represented at the low end of socioeconomic distributions, and because a core tenet of health differences research, as I just indicated on the previous slide, is that SCS is a direct and robust predictor of health outcomes, that these differential distributions of socioeconomic resources must be responsible for racialized differences in health outcomes. And then finally, we have the language of racialized health inequity, which suggests that net of any differences in individual behavior, any differences in, for instance, health insurance coverage or even medical care provision, or even socioeconomic distributions, there's something about the reliable reproduction of racialized differences in health outcomes that is preventable, avoidable, and consequently unnecessary, but additionally unfair and unjust. And this designation of being unfair and unjust anchors health differences work on the notions of social determinants, right? So this has to do with the nature of how society has been constructed and operates. Now, in a paper that I published 12 years ago now, wow. I did research on the historical development of socioeconomic status as a research construct in the United States of America. And the central finding of this is that SCS was developed almost exclusively from research done on white men in the US and in Northwestern Europe. So we have a construct, right? This combination of education, occupation, or income that was developed with a single demographic that has been applied, often uncritically and without acknowledging how it was developed, to a broader range of demographics, right? So women, people of color, folks who immigrate to the US from other places in the world. And, you know, a relative shortcoming associated with many researchers not acknowledging or understanding this history is a general absence of advanced theories which do a good job of exploring and explaining the relationship between race and ethnicity and health, right? Other than the conventional SES, health behaviors, or even social, that is, racial discrimination. And so one outcome of that general absence of more advanced or sophisticated theories is that the relationship between SES and health varies considerably across racial and ethnic groups, right? So in some cases, improvements in conventionally measured socioeconomic status is actually associated with improved health. In other cases, there is no improvement or no change in health. And in some cases, increases in formal education, more prestigious jobs, higher income, and greater wealth accrual over the life course and across generations is systematically associated with more compromised health, right? And so on the slide here, at the top level, we have race ethnicity in the first column. We have health outcomes in the second column. And then in the third column, we have the effect of higher SES. A positive sign indicates that health is improved as a function of higher SES. A 0 implies that there's no change in health status as a function of increases in SES. And the negative sign indicates that there are actual losses associated or more compromised health is systematically associated with improvements in conventionally measured SES. Two outcomes, birth outcomes, well, I guess several outcomes of birth outcomes, but birth outcomes writ large, whether it's preterm birth, birth weight, or infant mortality. And so a range of birth outcomes, but it's pretty consistent. And for allostatic load, which is a measure of physiological stress response, and these are all studies that I actually worked on myself, we see that for US whites, increases in SES actually improves birth outcomes, reduces allostatic load. For Blacks, increases in SES, conventionally measured socioeconomic status, does not improve health for birth outcomes or allostatic load. And for US-born Mexicans, the same story. Increases in conventionally measured SES does not improve birth outcomes and does not reduce allostatic load, this measure of physiological stress response. And for foreign-born Mexicans, increases in conventionally measured SES, that is higher SES, is actually systematically associated with, that is, it predicts more compromised or losses in health status for both birth outcomes and allostatic load. So what's happening? I argue that factors associated with structural racism, which for the purposes of this evening's talk is defined as sets of social arrangements, relationships, and conditions that are systemically advantageous to majority population whites while being simultaneously systemically disadvantageous to minority populations of color, right? So social arrangements, relationships, conditions that advance the perspectives of some and constrain those of others. Structural racism holds that macro-level social processes associated with racial construction, racial hierarchy, as well as racial bias are central organizing features of the nation that were established before its founding, that remain salient to the US social order until the present, and that these are multifaceted, interconnected, co-occurring phenomenon that are also dynamic and responsive. This means that structural racism is inextricably linked to US national identity. It pervades and suffuses virtually every major institution comprising US society and is consequently systemic. So what we're talking about here is big picture, woven into the very fabric of who we are as a nation state, right? As such, it negatively determines the life chances and lived experiences of US-based populations of color to the benefit of white Americans, far beyond individual acts of interpersonal racial discrimination, which unfortunately is what most people think of when they hear the language of racism. This is who we are as a nation state. This is who we've been since before the inception or the formal inception of the nation. and current animated protest against overt dehumanization of Blacks through police misconduct notwithstanding, who we are likely to continue to be without similarly animated public policy changes in our political, economic, educational, academic, policing, and carceral and legal justice systems. Race or racial construction. Race is a social construct conceived of, developed, imposed, maintained, and perpetuated by European immigrants to the emerging US. The race construct dehumanized the social other to justify material exploitation of Native Americans through appropriation of their historical lands and economic exploitation of Black Africans through the institution of chattel slavery. So the race construct is about stolen land and stolen labor, but it's also about stolen humanity and stolen lives, stolen history, heritage, and culture, and perhaps most importantly, stolen narratives. Who has historically gotten to tell the race story has major implications for our capacity to understand race or our inability to understand race as a social construct in contemporary times. Race suggested that differences in desirable underlying traits like intelligence, family values, and work ethic were inherently and systematically associated with one or some combination of phenotype, what people look like, geographic origin, where they came from, or ancestry, who their foremothers and forefathers could be documented to have been. These same Northwestern European immigrants argued that notions of these differences in characteristics implied a natural hierarchy of human populations, with themselves disproportionately displaying desirable characteristics and consequently worthy of being at the pinnacle of this social hierarchy, while all populations of color, and to be fair, some European populations diverse on the dimensions of national origin and ethnicity, that is, that at the inception of this race construct, Italians, Irishmen, Polish, and Jewish populations were not considered white race. That was reserved for the Northwestern European immigrants. And one phenomenon associated with racialization processes in the United States of America is that we've seen an increasingly inclusive and expansive white racial category. Belief in and values associated with notions of this natural system became normalized over time. And these normalized views and beliefs were institutionalized through policy decision-making that effectively established and maintains a rigid, stratified social hierarchy reflecting notions of differential human valuation characterized by socially constructed and imposed race. And so it uses some combination of what people look like, where they came from, and who their ancestors were as social markers for differential treatment, right? And so you had notions that these differences existed and that they were inherent, despite no compelling scientific evidence that that was the case. An entire society was constructed around those beliefs. Those beliefs became normalized. And what was a cognitive representation of the world as pertains to race became a social reality, race as a social construct. Positive bias, notions of supremacy, that is, that one group is indeed inherently superior and reserves the right to construct the society that everyone lives in. Privilege, the sets of advantages, unearned advantages that are conferred as a function of preferential status in such a system. And negative social bias, oppression, the mechanisms that relegate those deemed socially inferior, racialized populations to inferior positions, and discrimination, actively engaging social processes that incur unearned disadvantages upon those who are deemed racially inferior. So we're talking about distributions of we're also talking about institutional engagement. And what this means is we cannot assume that if we see a person of color who has a certain level of education, that that education necessarily translates into labor market engagement, that is, employment opportunities, the same or similarly as it does for a majority population person, and that even if a minority population person actually gets the job, that they're compensated at the same rate, that is, that the income is the same, and that with that income, even if it is the same, the purchasing power, that is, the interest rate that you get on a home or a car loan is the same as it is for a majority population person. In fact, there's compelling evidence for each of those claims, which demonstrates that indeed this racial bias, both positive and negative, characterizes the lives of white Americans versus populations of color in the US in very different ways, and that institutional engagement results in differential returns upon investment of resources at every level. Ethnic identity, distinct from race, is about sets of beliefs, values, practices, and portrayals which are self-constructed and comprise autonomous institutions with positive functional value. Race is externally constructed and imposed. Ethnicity is internally constructed, right? Self-constructed. And, generally reflect positively upon the populations that are developing them, right? So it's just how groups view themselves. And folks who do this work argue that there's some agency associated with constructing an identity for yourself versus having one externally constructed and imposed, right? Two dimensions of ethnicity. The first is attributional, which is the self-perception that ethnic populations bring to bear. So this is within group. The second is relational, which argues that the positions that ethnic populations are relegated to as a function of racial assignment in a particular social order has implications for the degree to which they're able to bring that positive identity construction process to bear. And I will explain to you in just a second what this looks like in real life. So here's the model, which introduces a conceptual framework of structural racism. So you're going to see me look off to the right. I have two monitors operating here, so I want to make sure that I can put my little arrow here to indicate. So in the US, majority population, white racial and white American subjects have constructed a society where they have relatively direct and unfettered access to primary resources of opportunity, particularly socioeconomic resources, and that those resources reliably translate into improved health status as the dominant narrative suggests it should. And this is referred to, this relatively direct, unfettered access to these resources, as racialized social privilege. The majority population has also constructed race, a socialized racial categorization, and mechanisms for racial discrimination that racialized populations have to engage and negotiate to gain access to the resources that the majority population has relatively unfettered access to. Those of us, let's say, for instance, ethnic Black Americans, the direct descendants of former slaves, or those whose primary socialization occurs in the social context of the United States of America, construct our ethnic identities within the context of directly externally constructed and imposed race. As a function, Black Americans develop what we refer to as alternative social cultural orientations that allow them to engage and negotiate racial discrimination, hopefully more effectively. Whereas populations of color, let's say Blacks who were born on the continent of Africa or in the Caribbean, construct their ethnic identity, not having to contend with directly imposed racial constraints. They may be aware, but they're not contending again with the direct negative imposition of socialized racial categorization. Upon immigration to the United States of America, for those populations of color who are foreign born, this process of racialization actually begins, right? You may arrive here not knowing who you are, but if you stay here long enough, not only will we in the United States of America tell you, we will show you in terms of how you engage our major institutions, what it means to be racialized. And there are sets of alternative cultural orientations that those who construct ethnicity outside of the US bring with them, that is traditional social cultural values. And another core finding in the research that I do is that recently arrived immigrants to the United States of America, whether they are Black, Latino, or even white immigrants, consistently have health profiles superior to their US-born co-racial counterparts whose ethnic identity construction happens in the context of the United States of America. And then finally, I have a dotted arrow here associated with the alternative cultural orientation because there's some evidence to suggest that for some racialized populations in the United States of America, if the cost associated with engaging discriminatory institutions is too great, or the positive returns that can be expected upon application of conventional resources is too reduced, some populations engage alternative cultural orientations and the resources found there in such a way that they completely circumvent all of this. Think alternative economic enterprising. And I will lead you all or leave you all to interpret that as you will. And so now we get to the set of empirical findings that were informed by the conceptual framework that of structural racism that I just shared with you all. And again, in this project, we were more interested in the theoretical and conceptual underpinnings of what structural racism looks like in a city like Detroit. And we were really, really interested in what happens when populations from different racial groups are all concentrated in the same geographic area, contending with the same set of constraints. And so you think about Detroit, not a lot of jobs, increasing poverty from the mid 70s up through the early 2000s, out-migration of relatively well-to-do whites, increased percentages of Blacks, and a more recent Mexican immigration to Detroit also, right? And so we're not just talking about urban poverty for Black populations. There's lots of work which explores that phenomenon. But again, what happens when white folks and brown folks find themselves in the same set of social conditions that have historically disproportionately characterized the lives of urban Blacks? And so, again, this notion of structural racism, two concepts, high effort coping and weathering hypothesis, and I'll give you brief conceptual definitions of each of those now. High effort coping is measured by something called the John Henryism scale of high effortful coping. And what this proposes is that some populations or some individuals within minority populations are born with an inherent predisposition to work hard to overcome structural and institutional impediments to success, with the belief that it can actually be done, that they can achieve success in a biased system. Unfortunately, those structural and institutional constraints, the mechanisms, may be beyond the capacity of those who are racialized, that is, racialized minorities, to actually overcome. And it requires a personal resource expenditure that is so psychologically and emotionally taxing that it results in more compromised health and well-being over time, right? And so it's stressful, and stress predisposes those who score high on the John Henryism scale to chronic and degenerative disease. Most frequently, the outcome that folks who who use the high effort coping skill measure or used to measure the impact is high blood pressure, hypertension. The weathering hypothesis, developed initially for Black women in the US of childbearing age, has been applied to a broader range of populations and for other outcomes, but it suggests that for individuals who simultaneously occupy social identities of Black, female, and low SCS, the cumulative biological impact of being chronically exposed to and having to cope with socially structured stressors, coupled with the degradation of the kinds of alternative social cultural resources that I highlighted on the structural inequality conceptual frameworks slide, when those are degraded by policy decision-making, stress associated with those processes compromises health and actually accelerates biological aging. We have two measures that we use to gauge these constructs: allostatic load, which I highlighted earlier, which is a measure of physiological stress, and telomere length. And I assume because many of you all are in the natural sciences or biosciences, that you're familiar with this, which is good. But telomeres are a measure of accelerated biological aging as opposed to chronological aging. And telomeres are the stabilizing caps on the ends of chromosomes that protect them from deteriorating when they reproduce, right? And so they naturally shorten over time. Every time a cell reproduces, they get a little shorter. And so we can measure chronological age by measuring telomere length. What we also know is that the rate at which telomeres degrade is stress responsive, right? So oxidative stress accelerates telomere degradation. And so what this means is you can have two people who are the exact same biological age, exact same chronological age, but if one of these people has had a particularly distressing life, their biological age will be more advanced than the other person who's not had to contend with that particularly distressing life. And in a study that co-authors and I published about 10 years ago, I'm in a comparison, and this is national level data, between white women and Black women, we found that at roughly age 45, Black women in the US were 7 years or so biologically older than white women, right? That is, this measure of telomere length suggested that Black women were contending with social stressors that was accelerating their biological aging relative to white women who were the same chronological age. So back to the Detroit study, primary data collection in collaboration with community researchers and bioscientists at labs in California and Utah, where we shipped off our biological samples. I knocked on roughly 250 doors and begged people to give us saliva 3 times a day over the course of 3 days, to do cortisol and to give us blood samples so we could do the telomere stuff. Fascinating work, pounding the streets of Detroit. And we had a simple set of research questions and hypotheses, and that is that the relationship between poverty status and telomere length will vary across race, ethnicity category. And the reason we were interested in Detroit was that, the percentage well, let me just put up a slide and show you that in the nation, the percentage of populations by race which have income below 25,000, for whites is 21%, for Blacks is 39%, for the Mexican origin population is 30%. In the city of Detroit, it's around 70% for all 3 populations. So once again, in Detroit, what we're trying to do is stabilize or standardize the poverty, non-poverty interaction across these different racial categories, right? And so here are our findings in brief. That among those who were poor in Detroit, so we stratified by poverty status and we looked at differences by race, whites who were poor in Detroit had bad health, that is, that they had short telomeres. Blacks who were poor in Detroit had moderate health, their telomeres were actually longer than poor whites. And the Mexican origin population in Detroit, who were poor, actually had good health. They had telomeres that were on average significantly longer than whites and blacks. Among the non-poor, whites in Detroit had good health. And so the direction of the influence of conventionally measured SES, that is going from being poor to being non-poor, went in the direction that the dominant narrative would suggest. For blacks, there was no significant difference. So while poor blacks had health that was superior to poor whites going to being non-poor actually had health improvement. Going from being poor to non-poor from blacks did not improve health, and non-poor blacks actually had health that was significantly worse than non-poor whites. And non-poor Mexican origin population in Detroit actually had telomeres that were significantly shorter than poor Mexicans in Detroit. Right? And so we have a number of explanations for why those sets of findings came out the way that they did. I will refrain from sharing those, and hopefully you all will ask the kinds of questions that allow us to get some insight into that. But we can say that in the context of Detroit, these notions of social identity processes absolutely reflect this idea that these are context-specific phenomena. And yeah, they're contingent upon the distribution of conventional resources, right? And conventional risk. But there's also something to be said for some alternative resources and alternative risk, again, that I'll reserve for the discussion. And this is the very last slide, and that is that policy implications as pertains to urban poverty have to take seriously the business of not just addressing the conventional socioeconomic or the distribution of conventional socioeconomic resources, but also the value of considering some alternative social cultural resources and the value of physical and social environments that confirm identity safety. And with that, I will stop share, I think, but I can pull that back up if folks have specific questions. So we should come back now.
Well, we'll start by thanking you and giving you a representative round of applause.
Thanks.
For the chart.
So I should also say it's better to get me in the morning when I'm not exhausted. So
well, thank you very much. And we can start accepting questions now. So if people want to put things into the Q&A, then we can ask Jay those questions. So we have one already from one of our students. It says, thank you for such an awesome talk, Dr. Pearson. My question, are racialized health differences are particularly obvious in the US, or is this a global phenomenon just with different dominant groups? i.e., does geography determine the conceptual and theoretical framework of structural racism as it applies to health inequity?
Excellent question. So we just finished, well, 2 courses actually, and in both courses we have students do projects comparing majority versus minority differences in the US versus those that occur other places in the world. And for our undergraduate course this year, we had students doing projects in Colombia, Brazil, Kenya, where else? Tanzania, India, and China. And what we found was hierarchies, stratified hierarchies of differential human valuation in each of these settings that predicted differences in health outcomes, right? And so even if the race construct isn't operating, if there are differences across ethnicity or tribal status, or even different regions in the country, we saw marked differences in distributions of resources and how reliably those distributions of resources translated resources and risk, and how reliably those distributions of resources and risk translated into differences in health outcomes. And so where race, is the stratified social hierarchy of differential human valuation in the United States of America. Certainly other places in the world have other stratified social hierarchies of differential human valuation. Again, ethnicity, tribal status, even religious status, that disproportionately negatively impact some populations and positively impact others. Excellent question.
Okay, another question came in. Have you been working with or sharing your work with other organizations to further disseminate your findings?
Yeah, so that's that's a really good question also. So the short answer to that question is yes. And part of the reason that I left the public health world and came to a school of public policy is that I realized that we in public health do a really good job of problematizing these phenomena and documenting that they exist. We weren't doing a good job of proposing solutions. And I thought that by going into a school of public policy, if we could have really good empirical evidence and make compelling arguments, we could get some traction. And it's just not happening the way that I anticipated or hoped that it would. And I have some hypotheses about why that happens. One has to do with the nature of, the very specific discipline-specific jargon that we all develop in our little siloed worlds that doesn't translate so well across other disciplines. And so we're working on collaborating with folks from different places to mitigate the impact of some of that. But quite frankly, and earlier today, I was just working on a draft. I have a conceptual paper on structural inequality for public policy decision makers. And one of the things that is showing up in the data that we've not yet linked to getting some action on working against the intractability of racialized health differences is belief in the American creed of egalitarian meritocracy, right? That is, that despite a clear history of racialized inequality to the tune of about 78%, most folks in the United States of America, including many people of color, really truly believe that opportunity structures, that is access to resources and protection from risk, are justly and fairly distributed across all populations. And if individuals or entire populations aren't doing well, it's because of them not responsibly wielding those resources, right? And so I suspect that unless and until we can change that narrative, all of the compelling evidence in the world is not going to shift people's beliefs that if you're not doing well in the US, it's because you're not working hard enough, right? So excellent question.
Okay, we have another question that, can you talk a little bit more about the negative relationship in the Mexican population?
Yeah, so I can give some hints. That's an excellent question. And so there's a phenomenon that I sometimes use in this talk called the Mexican health advantage. Some people call it the Mexican immigrant health paradox, where recently arrived Mexican immigrants, despite having very little formal education or no formal education in the US system, not having particularly prestigious, well-paying jobs, and certainly not having wealth holdings upon arrival, have remarkably positive health outcomes across a range of different indicators, right? So blood pressure, heart disease, cardiovascular disease. The most compelling outcome for me is birth outcomes. And over time, as these recently arrived Mexican immigrants, and this is both intergenerationally over time and intergenerationally for subsequent generations, the children and the grandchildren, as folks get more advanced formal education, more prestigious, better paying jobs, their health gets worse, right? So what we hypothesize is that there's something that recently arrived Mexican immigrants bring with them from their country of origin to the United States of America that confers health above and beyond what we expect and anticipate to be associated with conventionally measured socioeconomic status. I call it humanization, being treated decently, right? Being valued, being told that you matter. And there's a process of social othering or differential racialization that occurs, and that the longer folks are in the United States of America, the more that they learn what it means to be a social other or a hyphenated American. And as pertains to the Detroit findings, the folks who had low SES, that is, who were poor in Detroit, were more likely to be foreign born, more likely to live in households where they spoke Spanish, to have jobs where they spoke Spanish, and to live in predominantly Mexican neighborhoods, that is, Mexican town, Southeast Detroit. Those who had higher SES, that is, who were not poor, were more likely to have been born in the United States of America, speak English in their homes, and work on jobs where they had more direct and profound interactions with majority population whites in the United States of America, right? And so the value of those alternative resources, right? Resources found not just in the market economy, but in the social economy, being treated decently, being recognized as human, and being treated humanely should be considered, right? Human dignity. Great question.
Oof. So I have a kind of more biology telomere question.
Okay.
So telomeres, well, I guess I was recently surprised in my own research to learn that telomeres can be more dynamic and can
Yeah.
actually shorten and then increase as well. And oftentimes fluctuates with resources and exposure to stress and whatnot. Have you seen, do you have that kind of data where you have repeated measures from people? Have you seen that in your own work?
No, we do not. But just last week, I was in a meeting with a group of folks here at the medical school and some people in global health, where we're proposing to try to start a longitudinal study to get that and see if it varies over time. But that's a 20 to 25 year enterprise, and I hope to be near retirement by the time that stuff comes. But so we know that it is showing up in animal models. We've not seen it yet in human models, or at least if it's shown up, I'm not aware of it, right? But I know in some animal models where the cycles are much more, it happens more rapidly, it's shown up, but not in humans. Excellent question.
Okay, and then I'm just going to keep going as long as we have
Okay.
some time. So I'm assuming that you see pretty wide variability in a lot of these measures of stress indicators
Yep.
in the population. Have you started trying to think about maybe other kinds of mediators that might, you know, both cause the variability, but also that might, compensate for some of these, you know, um, socially determined impacts?
Yeah. Yeah, so short answer is yes. We wrote a paper a few years ago on the title of it is Jedi Public Health. And the gist of the paper has to do with the notion of identity safety and whether or not we can teach people in vulnerable situations how to more effectively cope with this stuff and understand. And so part of it is if we change the narrative on racism and racist interactions from interpersonal mediated stuff to these structural and institutional assessments, right? Maybe those who are being targeted will understand that they've not done anything wrong, that there's nothing inherently inferior about them. And the degree to which we can plug those folks into social networks, again, where they are humanized and confirmed, is the degree to which we hope we can reduce some of the stress from those exposures. But I would be remiss if I didn't also say we wrote an entire section on the value of helping social majority populations understand that these systems that disproportionately benefit them as a function of supremacy and privilege are not value free. And if privilege confers an advantage that is unearned, and if that advantage is a particular commodity, that means that somebody produced it, right? And so majority populations need to understand the role that they play in perpetuating systemic structural inequality by gender, by socioeconomic position, and certainly by race, that is structural racism. So both, right? Teach people newer, more effective ways to cope, but teach other people better ways to not create situations where some of us have to work so doggone hard to cope with other people's stuff. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have another question. Can you discuss the role of resiliency and protectiveness to adversity and stress within the Black population, especially?
Yeah, all right, I'll get real. Yeah, I can talk about resiliency. So here's what I'll say. Most of the folks I know who are doing resiliency research don't look like me. It is majority population folks who have some fascinating psychological theories about how to teach minority populations more new and more effective ways to cope with their minority status. There's a really cool paper by an author. His last name is Anderson. I cannot remember his name right now, and it's just a commentary. It's only 2 pages. And the title of the paper is, Have We Gone Too Far with Resiliency? And what he says is, teaching resiliency is like lining up 10 young Black men, hitting them all in the head with a bat. 5 of them die, which is what you might expect if you hit somebody in the head with a bat. 5 live. And then you go and investigate the 5 who live and try to figure out what it is about them that is so hard-headed that allows them to survive. And then you want to teach other people how to have a hard head. Meanwhile, nobody is asking, who's this fool with the bat running around hitting people in the head? And why aren't we stopping him from hitting people in the head? Or to put it another way, why do some of us have to be so damn resilient just to get what other people expect as a normal way of life? And so, I'm a first generation college student. I come from abject poverty and other forms of profound social pathology. But I would hope that we understand the value of creating a society where no one would have to go through and be subjected to some of the challenges that I've had to go through to get to the place where some of my colleagues who grew up in households with 2 parents who are professors don't even know exist, right? And again, I'm not diminishing the value of resiliency, but how about we teach majority population folks to be more resilient against defending their interest and pretending that this thing is just and fair when it absolutely positively is not.
Okay, along those lines, and a follow up. Do you find geographic, well, I guess you kind of answered this already, or, over the last 50 years, we like to believe that we've made some progress towards addressing some of these issues. I've in full acknowledgement that we haven't gotten there. Have you do you have access to data that could address whether or not some of the social mechanisms that people have been fighting for have made any progress health-wise?
Yeah. So the short answer to that question is this isn't work that I do, but I certainly have colleagues. Chief among them is an economist at Berkeley, Rucker Johnson is his name. And he has pretty good evidence to document changes in Black American health status as a function of civil rights policy, particularly educational policy in the United States of America. And so policy decision-making absolutely positively does matter. There's some really interesting research on allostatic load or stress response that saw, and I know 2 people who were in the field when this happened back in 2008 through 2010 when Obama became the president of the United States of America. And they saw significant reductions in mean allostatic load for Black folks in different geographic regions around the country, right? And their hypothesis is there's something about seeing a Black man as the president of the United States of America that was confirming and supportive and encouraging for Black Americans, right? So yes, excellent question. Let's see. Are we still in the chat and the Q&A?
Yeah, so one is, what policy changes has your research led to? That you have anyway?
None. I'm just, it's true. It's true. I mean, that's what I was saying earlier about being frustrated. It takes a while to spin this stuff up. And then, like I said, is that Cash or is it Hug? That was Cash.
That's Huck. They're
That's
grown up.
Huck. Oh, wow. Okay. Anyway, sorry. These are kids that I've known for a while, you all. Anyway. So no, it to my knowledge, it's not translated into any significant policy change. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. Like I said, I left public health to come to a school of public policy. I have some compelling stuff that I'm working on that may have implications for what happens here in North Carolina. But quite frankly, we're swimming now against the prevailing tide. There are some things that have changed in broader opinion surveys about race and gender in the United States of America over the course of the past years in some alarming ways, right? And so, this stuff can can switch pretty quickly. But no, nothing major that I'm aware of that has happened. We've gotten some press. I got to be on television and in the New York Times and other stuff, but yeah.
To start, right? First steps.
Yep.
So one more question in the Q&A. Many of our students are future healthcare providers. How do we help them to promote their understanding of the role of humanizing those in their care as a form of social justice?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I can tell you what we do here at Duke. I actually teach several courses, but the ones that I enjoy teaching the most have to do with public policy ethics. And the master's course that I do in public policy ethics is one of the more popular ones here at Duke University, and I get a broad range of students from many disciplines. And the course spins around 3, possibly 4 core constructs. The first one is human dignity, and that is, by lieu of existing, each and every one of us reserves the right to have access to the full range of resources and protection from the array of risks such that we can maximize our greatest human potential, right? The second is integrity of identity. Access to those resources or protection from those risks should not be contingent upon anyone being anything other than the whole truth of who they are, right? Across race, gender, across gender identity and expression, across sexual orientation, across national origin, ethnicity, regional orientation, regional origin, right? The third construct is structural inequality, which holds that there are sets of social processes, arrangements, relationships, and conditions that advance and highlight the interests and perspectives of majority groups while constraining those of minority groups, and that it's built into our very system, and we need to work to offset that. And then the final one is social justice informed relational equity. That real inequality is about differences in relationships. And if we can figure out how to normalize healthy relationships across an increasingly diverse and dynamic United States of America, we can get some traction on this, right? And so I think the first thing is to have courses that give students over a semester term, and maybe even a semester and a half, because we have some major projects that extend beyond the semester, an opportunity to get deep into the conceptual and theoretical and empirical literature, demonstrating in no uncertain term the very real impact of a fundamentally unjust social order, this thing we call the United States of America, and how that extends into and impacts folks other places in the world. We're really good at packaging and exporting stuff. So yeah. Excellent.
Well, again, thank you so much for spending your evening, of course, with us. And thank you also for agreeing to spend some time with our students after this. I don't want to cut in too much into their time with you. So we will say thank you and goodbye. And okay. Again, thanks so much for spending time with us.
Oh, I see him now. Bye, Taylor. Who's that? Hi. You don't remember me. You were just a little fella the last time I saw you.
Yep, now I'm 4.
I know. Anyway,